Hey everyone, thanks so much for tuning in. And I want to pose a question first and foremost. Is a gravel bike a bike packing bike? Well, clearly it is here because it's the bike I have in the stand and it worked for me this past week. But I do think that there is some common misconceptions among the bike industry and specifically among bike manufacturers that can't separate or can't differentiate bike packing and gravel. And there's some manufacturers specifically making their bike packing bike, which is a gravel bike. And that's not necessarily true. When we did a survey last year, our global bike packing survey, we surveyed over 5,000 people, and it was clear that gravel bikes were not on the top of the list, but hardtail mountain bikes and rigid mountain bikes were. And for good reason. You know, you've got bigger tire clearance and volume in those bikes that can take on a little bit more unknown terrain, but they also can take on gravel roads and even pavement. Those bikes also have longer wheelbases in which they're a little bit more stable, especially with a loaded rig. Many of those bikes also are just coming with flat bars instead of drop bars. Flat bars allow you to basically throw on a bunch of accessories on the bar, not have to worry about the width of your handlebar bag or your harness, and it gives you a little bit more of an upright position as well. That all being said, gravel bikes are evolving. I definitely think that there's a time and a place and an application for them out there. Gravel bikes have definitely come a long way in the past few years, almost even resembling old touring bikes with super long wheelbases. So a gravel bike can be a good bike packing bike with a few caveats. You might need to pack a little bit lighter. So these bikes are definitely built for the race course, or at the very least, they're not necessarily built for strapping 40 pounds of gear to the bike. So being conscious of knowing where and how much weight you can pack and how much weight the bike can handle is important. You know, some bikes are not necessarily built as strong as others. The tubing or the carbon isn't as thick as some other mountain bikes out there. So knowing the limits is important. Another caveat is being able to understand the terrain that this bike can handle. So obviously, being able to go on a graded gravel farm road in Iowa or Minnesota or even out east or out west is something that this bike can definitely handle. But when you start getting into a little bit more forest service road terrain, a little bit more chunk, some 2-track, some single track, the bike starts to lose its capabilities pretty quickly. So understanding those limits is also important. That being said, there is a thing called underbiking, and that's my last caveat. I think that is something that a lot of people actually enjoy, is bringing a tool that's definitely not made for the job, but just going for it. And I think there are a lot of people out there that enjoy doing that. And I think there's something to be said about that. It's definitely something to be proud of. It kind of reminds me a little bit of the clunkers back in the 80s and 90s in Crested Butte and Marin County, when they basically transformed their townies into mountain bikes and were hauling downhill through rocks, chunk, everything, because that was the tool that they had. So going into the evolution of gravel bikes a little bit, they've evolved because we've kind of started taking them on a little bit more rough terrain. What we've seen is tire clearance grow. We've also seen tire diameter options. So you've got 700 by, I think this bike takes up to 45, so I've got 42s on there. This bike can also take 650 by 2.0. Some bikes even allow 650 by 2.1. And I think that the 700 has a little bit more of a deflection characteristic. When you hit rocks or something, your tire is going to kind of move away from that rock, whereas a 650B will allow you to almost absorb that bump a little bit more. Sure, deflection is definitely still a possibility, but comes with a little bit more of a comfort characteristic, a little bit more flexing in the tire, which does create a little bit more comfort, especially if you're bike packing day in and day out, whereas that 700 will definitely be a little bit more rough on the body. So if you're curious in looking at specific bikes, head to our gear index page and I'll link that below. But there's a great resource on our webpage where it shows all of our 650B drop bar bikes out there in the world. And then we also have a great resource on drop bar mountain bikes, or 29er drop bar mountain bikes that are available. And we specifically chose 2-inch or greater tire clearance bikes because it truly is a better experience while bike packing. Let's chat a little bit about the pros and cons and some modifications that I would make to this gravel bike. So first and foremost, just gravel geometry is more similar to road geometry, where the top tube isn't necessarily sloped, it remains pretty high, and that definitely changes from bike to bike, but mountain bikes tend to slope their top tubes, so a gravel bike will definitely give you a little bit more frame bag space or frame space or even space to add mounts. And in this case, in this Salsa Warbird, there's a variety of mounts within the frame where I can add 2 water bottles. Actually, I can add 3 water bottles if I didn't have this frame bag in there, and it will work great for an all-day adventure. But in this case, it works really well with 2 water bottles and a frame bag. Like I mentioned before, the longer wheelbase. So longer wheelbases kind of started with touring bikes because the longer the wheelbase, the more stable it is, especially when you add a bunch of weight to the bike. So being able to have a longer wheelbase not only helps with being able to have stability with a loaded rig, but it also makes this bike more stable at higher speeds over rough terrain. So say you're going over some washboards or something like that, even without bike packing bikes, you'll notice the difference between this bike and say a regular road bike. So just comping between road bikes and gravel bike tire clearances, obviously the biggest difference here is you have a lot more clearance on a gravel bike. Some road bikes you only have 28 millimeter clearance. In this gravel bike I have a 45 millimeter clearance, which is quite a bit, and I have 42 millimeter tires on there right now. And comparing to a 28, that's a lot of volume, and that's a lot more comfort and a lot more contact patch on the ground, which also helps create more stability and more mud clearance, which is super helpful when you're bike packing and not knowing the weather ahead. Last but not least, it's great because it's designed for a specific ride, a specific road, a specific type of riding, and that is gravel riding. Many of these bikes are designed and have technology to, like I was mentioning, go over washboards, and they have vibration damping, and they might not be the snappiest or fastest bike out there, but they're stable, they're still light, they're quick, and they're pretty fun to ride. But like I said, there are plenty of cons as well. And for starters, the tire clearance. Obviously, if you go with a 650B option, I think that's great. The 700C definitely limits you a little bit more. Comparing them to a road bike, it's great. But comparing them to, say, a mountain bike or, a hardtail mountain bike, full suspension mountain bike, they definitely lack the capacity to run larger volume tires, which in turn will definitely beat you up a little bit more. So another con to most gravel bikes is gearing. So it's definitely evolved and changed over the past, I would say even just year, with the Shimano GRX, which has been super helpful, but many bikes are still being spec'd with almost road-like gearing. So for instance, this is a 36-31, that's my granny gear, and I still could use more granny gear going uphill, going up a steep pitch with all of this loaded weight on my bike. So if you do have just a 1x drivetrain, consider maybe putting on a smaller chainring up front. Or if you have a 2x, consider maybe throwing a larger cassette on the back. I did a video on the GRX drivetrain and how to make it the widest range gearing possible by swapping out cassettes. So definitely take a look at that, and I'll link that in the description below. So I made a bunch of modifications to this bike before my most recent bike packing trip on it, and it definitely helped with a number of things. For starters, what I ended up doing was throwing larger or wider handlebars on there. Not only were there narrow handlebars on the bike in the first place, they didn't really have much flare out in the drops that give you a little bit more stability, but also creates more room for handlebar bags. So I added 46 centimeter bars, and to be honest, I probably should have added 48s or 50s because having more is just a lot more stable and a lot more comfortable. That being said, it definitely gives me a little bit more comfort. When I have a little bit too much comfort, sometimes I tend to turn the bike a little bit more than it should be turned, more of like a drop bar mountain bike. So I do end up from time to time hitting my shoe on the front wheel, which can be dangerous. Another thing that I did when I swapped the bars out was I swapped the stem. So many of these race-ready bikes come with the stem slammed. So all you have to do is just basically swap it. You don't have to buy another stem, and it puts you in a more upright position. If you want an even more upright position, you could definitely consider getting, plus minus 10 or plus minus 15, and maybe even coming back a little bit. So, if you have an 80 mil stem going to a 70 mil stem, that's going to put you in a more upright position. So the other thing I did was swap out tires. This bike, I had 35 mil tires on. I ended up throwing 42s on, and if you want, you could always get a supple sidewall. So this has just the tan, light, and supple sidewalls, which at the right tire pressure will help create a more comfortable ride quality over rougher terrain and over the long haul. The other thing I did was add a bunch of water bottles. So many of these gravel bikes now come with a bunch of mounts that you can add water bottles. I think this bike can add 6 water bottles, and that's really awesome for just long days in the saddle or races or bike packing. And for this instance, I was able to carry 4 water bottles and then added another cage down at the underneath of the down tube to carry most of my tool kit. And this system worked really well. The other thing I did was I added aero bars. And no, they're not necessarily to be aero, although it does help when you have a headwind. But it's just another hand position, another position of comfort. Back in 2015, when I did a bunch of research on the Tour Divide, I was doing research and everybody had aero bars. And I was like, aero bars, what's this for? And the more research I did, the more I found out that it's for comfort. It's for hand positions. And it's a super comfortable position when you're riding gravel roads or pavement for an extended period of time. Paired with being able to be in the hoods, in the drops on top of the bar, it just creates basically a 4th hand position. Not to mention it also creates more mounting positions for, say, lights or GPS. And last but not least, just added a bunch of bike packing bags. And I will do a separate video on unpacking this specific setup because I've gotten a lot of questions on it. So is a gravel bike a good bike packing bike? Obviously, you just heard some pros and cons on the matter. But I want to hear from you. Do you think that these manufacturers are building too gravel-oriented bikes, or do you like what you see in the industry? So please leave a comment in the comment section with your answer and your opinion. I'd love to hear it, and thank you so much for tuning in. If you haven't done so, please make sure to hit that subscribe button, and I look forward to all of your comments. Thanks for tuning in.